Okay, we're going to see how this works. Again, I'm on my iPad, and I'm trying to read from my iPhone. And the camera's to one side. And you want to keep looking in the center. But anyway, shouldn't Juneteenth be Decembixth, as I would say it? Okay, this will initially seem crazy, but follow my logic. And actually, it's not my logic, it's the logic of wokeism or wokeness. So we recently, just the other day, established Juneteenth as a national holiday and actually celebrated it nationwide for the first time. The geniuses who sold us on it snookered us, I think, especially the black celebrants. You say, what? Juneteenth is not a celebration of anything black people did, nothing the freed slaves did. It's a white man's work. In fact, the white man responsible for Juneteenth might be described as the recipient of explicitly white privilege. After all, isn't anything a white man does tainted? Here's the fact. We are being told that as the children of immigrants who were not even here in the 16th, 17th, or 18th centuries, and were never involved in the slave trade anywhere, unless, of course, our ancestors were held in slavery back in their homeland, that we're still guilty if we're white. Okay? Others are telling us that even with psychological counseling, we might never recover from our whiteness and everything that brings about, all the evil. And then there's still others suggesting five-year group meetings where we self-flagellate in front of each other, that's the answer. All right. The new dialogue seems to be that nothing good can come from white people. So how does a white man of above average privilege factor into Juneteenth? What good could come from anything that a white person does anyway? So let's address why I say this individual had privilege. All right? The white man I'm speaking of was one United States General Gordon Granger, a privileged white man that rose through the ranks of the Union Army to the rank of general. That's not your normal everyday feat, and it's one that's reserved to the few and thus proud. Isn't that a near cousin of privilege, if it's not a twin? All right, so what happened? On June 19th, 1865, federal troops under the command of this General Gordon Granger entered victoriously into Galveston, Texas. Texas was the last bastion of the CSA and was finally vanquished. So, enter General Granger. Now, were the slaves ultimately free now that General Lee had surrendered 2 months earlier to General Grant at Appomattox? Were the slaves free because the Emancipation Proclamation, published 2.5 years earlier, freed them? No and no. Remember, slavery was still the law in 2 Union border states, Delaware and Kentucky, until the 13th Amendment was ratified, freeing all U.S. slaves in December of 1865, fully 6 months after June 19th, 1865. The day that has come to be celebrated is Juneteenth. Now, this brings us back to what then does Juneteenth commemorate? Not the end of slavery. Slavery still existed in the Union, of all places. Supposedly the bastion of abolitionists and those fighting to bring about emancipation. So, were the slaves in Galveston celebrating the end of the war and their newfound freedom? Well, the 13th Amendment freeing all slaves was still 6 months away. So were the slaves in Texas free? Well, they weren't free on June 18th. Not until the privileged white General Granger stood on Texas soil and read, quote, General Orders Number 3, declaring, the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. End of quote. But in fact, while the slaves in Texas were not free, they were now free because General Granger made it so by the might of the Union Army that he represented. All slaves were not free. There were slaves in the Union that would not be free for 6 more months. Additionally, the reference to the, quote, Executive of the United States responsible for the so-called proclamation had been assassinated 2 months earlier. And the proclamation, dated January 1st, 1863, had not freed one slave. The slaves that had purported to free were all in the slave states, no longer under the control of the Union and Mr. Lincoln. And the slave states that he did not control, that were still in the Union, that he did control, border states that had slavery, Delaware and Kentucky, they were allowed to keep their slaves upon promise not to secede. One begins to wonder, is that the basis of how our government gives immunity from prosecution to murderers who agree to testify against other murderers? Sure, it's tongue-in-cheek, but really. Here, we're going to end slavery, but you guys, if you stay with us, you can keep your slaves. But we're going to go after them and get rid of their slaves. All right. Well, to complete my thesis, while all slaves were not freed by the executive's proclamation of January 1st, 1863, nor were any slaves in Texas freed by such. The slaves in Texas were informed of their freedom on June 19th, 1865, by force of the Union Army coming to bear there and the actions of General Granger. As I stated earlier, on the day before, they were still slaves. The proclamation didn't free them. You could tell people, hey, Lincoln published a proclamation, you're free. Yeah, tell that to their Confederate owners. They were no more free than the slaves in Delaware and Kentucky weren't free. So, speaking of all slaves in the Union enclaves of Delaware and Kentucky, well, they were going to have to wait for the 13th Amendment. So, rather than Juneteenth, the result of the Texas slaves being freed by the actions of one white man, General Gordon Granger, being the celebration of the final emancipation of slaves in the U.S., shouldn't we be more correctly celebrating the final ratification of the 13th Amendment that ended all slavery, say as Decembixth, emphasis on not as snappy as Juneteenth, but more accurate. Unless, of course, we choose truth over facts, which was a recent genius proclamation by another executive. So look, how's my logic? Does it make sense? Did I explain woke logic so that you can understand it? Please, change my mind. All right, thanks for listening.